I've always been fascinated by abandoned places. There's a certain thrill in exploring the forgotten and decayed, where time has stood still and whispers of the past linger in the air. So when I heard about the old psychiatric hospital on the outskirts of town, I couldn't resist. It was the perfect place for my next adventure. The hospital, Grayfield Asylum, had been shut down in the late 1980s after a series of scandals. Patients had been mistreated, and there were rumors of gruesome experiments conducted in the bowels of the building. Naturally, these stories only added to my excitement. I decided to go alone. It was a Saturday evening, and the sun was beginning to set as I made my way through the dense forest surrounding the asylum. The building loomed in the distance, its silhouette jagged against the dusky sky. Vines crept up the crumbling walls, and broken windows gaped like empty eye sockets. I found an opening in the rusted chain-link fence and slipped through, the metal groaning in protest. The courtyard was overgrown, weeds pushing through the cracks in the pavement. A cold breeze rustled the leaves, and I shivered, pulling my jacket tighter around me. As I approached the main entrance, the sense of foreboding grew stronger. The heavy wooden doors were ajar, hanging off their hinges. I took a deep breath and stepped inside. The air was stale, carrying a faint smell of mold and decay. My footsteps echoed in the vast, empty hall. Dust motes danced in the dim light, filtering through the broken windows. I pulled out my flashlight and turned it on, the beam cutting through the gloom. The first floor was relatively uneventful. Peeling paint, shattered glass, and the occasional piece of broken furniture littered the rooms. I took a few photos, feeling a strange mix of exhilaration and unease. It wasn't until I reached the second floor that things started to get unsettling. I found myself in a long, narrow corridor lined with patient rooms. Most of the doors were closed, but one at the far end was slightly open. As I walked past the closed doors, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I quickened my pace. The open door led to what appeared to be a small office. Papers were scattered across the floor, and a metal filing cabinet stood open, its drawers yanked out and emptied. I sifted through the papers, hoping to find something interesting. Among the scattered documents, I found a patient file that caught my eye. The name had been redacted, but the details were disturbing. The patient had been committed for violent tendencies and severe hallucinations. The file mentioned that they had been subjected to experimental treatments, though it didn't specify what those treatments were. I stuffed the file into my backpack and was about to leave when I heard it, a faint whisper, so soft I thought I might have imagined it. I froze, straining to hear. The whisper came again, clearer this time, a single word: help. My blood ran cold. I spun around, shining my flashlight into the hallway. It was empty. The whispering continued, growing more frantic. I couldn't pinpoint the source. It seemed to come from all around me. Driven by a mix of fear and curiosity, I followed the sound down the corridor. It led me to a staircase at the far end, descending into the basement. I hesitated, staring into the darkness below. Every instinct screamed at me to turn back, but I couldn't. I had to know. The basement was even colder than the rest of the building. My flashlight flickered as I descended, the steps creaking under my weight. The whispering grew louder, more urgent. I reached the bottom and found myself in a labyrinth of narrow passages and small, windowless rooms. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and something else, something metallic. Blood. I followed the whispers to a heavy steel door. My hand trembled as I reached for the handle. It was icy cold, sending a shiver up my spine. The door creaked open, revealing a small room bathed in an eerie red light. In the center of the room was a metal table, its surface stained with dark, dried blood. Restraints hung from the sides, and various surgical instruments were scattered around. This was where the experiments had taken place. A figure stood in the corner, barely visible in the dim light. My heart leapt into my throat. It was a woman, her face gaunt and eyes hollow. She wore a tattered hospital gown, and her arms were covered in deep, angry scars. "Help me," she whispered, her voice a raspy plea. I stepped closer, unable to tear my eyes away. Her gaze locked onto mine, filled with a pain so intense it was almost tangible. "I'm sorry," I stammered, not knowing what else to say. "I don't know how." "Find the others," she said, her voice growing fainter. "Set us free." Before I could respond, she vanished. One moment she was there, the next she was gone, leaving me alone in the cold, red-lit room. I backed away, my mind reeling. What had I just seen? I turned and fled, racing through the basement and up the stairs, my flashlight bobbing wildly. The whispers followed me, growing louder and more insistent. Faces seemed to materialize in the shadows, eyes filled with desperation and rage. By the time I burst out of the asylum, the sun had set completely, and the forest was shrouded in darkness. I didn't stop running until I reached my car. My hands shook as I fumbled with the keys, finally managing to unlock the door and climb inside. I sat there for a long moment, trying to calm my racing heart. The file in my backpack felt like a lead weight. I had to know more. I had to find out what had happened to those poor souls trapped in Grayfield Asylum. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. For a split second, I saw her, the woman from the basement, standing at the edge of the forest, watching me with those hollow, haunted eyes. I don't know if I'll ever be able to set them free, but one thing is certain. I'll never forget the whispers of Grayfield Asylum, and I'll never go back. I never believed in the supernatural. Ghosts, demons, spirits, those were just stories to scare kids, right? At least that's what I thought until the night I decided to spend in the old Montgomery house. The Montgomery house stood at the edge of town, shrouded in legend and fear. It had been abandoned for decades after a series of gruesome events that left the family dead under mysterious circumstances. No one knew exactly what happened, but the rumors were enough to keep everyone away. Everyone except me. I'm a skeptic by nature, a man who deals in facts and logic. So when my friends dared me to spend the night in the Montgomery house, I accepted without hesitation. Prove them wrong, I thought. Show them there's nothing to be afraid of. I arrived at the house just as the sun was setting. The once grand mansion was a decaying ruin, its windows boarded up and the front door hanging on by a single hinge. The yard was overgrown, weeds and ivy choking the life out of what had once been a manicured garden. I pushed through the rusted gate, feeling a strange mix of excitement and unease. The front door creaked ominously as I stepped inside. The air was thick with dust and the smell of rot. My flashlight cast long shadows on the walls, and I could hear the faint scurrying of rats somewhere in the darkness. I set up my sleeping bag in the parlor, the largest room on the ground floor, and settled in for the night. It didn't take long for the house to start playing tricks on me. Strange noises echoed through the empty halls, footsteps, whispers, the sound of something heavy being dragged across the floor. At first, I chalked it up to the wind and my overactive imagination. But as the night wore on, the noises grew louder, more insistent. Around midnight, I decided to explore. Maybe if I found the source of the noises, I could put my mind at ease. I made my way through the darkened halls, my flashlight flickering ominously. The house was a maze of rooms and corridors, each one more dilapidated than the last. I found myself drawn to the basement, the place where the most gruesome rumors originated. They said the Montgomerys had a secret room down there, a place where they conducted strange rituals and experiments. I had to see it for myself. The basement stairs groaned under my weight, and the air grew colder the deeper I went. At the bottom, I found a heavy wooden door, slightly ajar. I pushed it open and stepped inside. The room was small and claustrophobic, the walls lined with shelves filled with dusty jars and old books. In the center of the room was a large wooden table, stained with dark, dried blood. The sight of it made my skin crawl. This was no ordinary basement. As I examined the room, I found a book lying open on the table. The pages were filled with strange symbols and diagrams, things I couldn't begin to understand. But the more I looked at them, the more I felt a growing sense of dread. This place wasn't just a house. It was something much darker. A sudden noise behind me made me jump. I spun around, my flashlight beam darting across the room. There was no one there, but I could feel a presence, something watching me from the shadows. I backed away, my heart pounding in my chest. As I reached the door, it slammed shut with a deafening bang. I was trapped. Panic set in as I tried to force the door open, but it wouldn't budge. The temperature in the room dropped suddenly, my breath visible in the cold air. I turned to face the table, and that's when I saw them, figures emerging from the shadows, their faces twisted in agony and rage. They were barely human, more like specters of the damned. They moved towards me, their whispers filling the air. "Leave," they hissed. "This place is cursed. You must leave." I backed away until I hit the wall, nowhere to run. My flashlight flickered and died, plunging the room into darkness. I could feel them closing in, their icy fingers brushing against my skin. Desperation took over, and I pounded on the door, screaming for help. And then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The figures vanished, the door flew open, and I stumbled out into the basement hallway. I didn't stop to question my luck. I ran, tearing through the house and out into the night, not stopping until I was safely back in my car. I never spoke about what happened that night, not to my friends, not to anyone. The Montgomery house remains empty, a dark stain on the town's history. I've driven past it a few times since then, but I've never gone back. I don't need to prove anything anymore, because now I know. There are things in this world that defy explanation, things that lurk in the shadows, waiting for the unsuspecting and the curious. And some doors, once opened, can never be closed. I was always the rational one, the one who never believed in ghosts or spirits. My friends would share their stories of haunted houses and creepy encounters, but I would laugh them off, chalking it all up to overactive imaginations. That was until I found the old journal. I work in a small, dusty bookstore on the outskirts of town, the kind of place that gets by on the charm of its creaky wooden floors and the musty smell of old paper. It's quiet, and I like it that way. But one rainy afternoon, while sorting through a box of donated books, I stumbled upon something unusual. The journal was leather-bound and worn, the pages yellowed with age. There was no name on the cover, just a strange symbol etched into the leather, a circle with an eye in the center. Intrigued, I decided to take it home and read it. I didn't realize at the time that I was inviting darkness into my life. That night, I sat down in my apartment and opened the journal. The handwriting was neat but cramped, the ink faded but still legible. The entries dated back to the early 1900s and told the story of a man named Samuel, who had moved into a remote farmhouse with his wife and young daughter. At first, the entries were mundane, detailing the daily struggles of farm life. But as I read on, the tone shifted. Samuel began describing strange occurrences, a cold wind that swept through the house even in the summer, whispers that echoed in the dead of night, and shadows that moved on their own. He wrote of his daughter, Emily, talking to someone who wasn't there, insisting she had an invisible friend named Lily. As the weeks went by, Samuel's entries grew more frantic. He described waking up to find scratches on the walls and doors that wouldn't stay closed. Emily's behavior became increasingly erratic. She would scream in the middle of the night, claiming that Lily was hurting her. Samuel's wife, Margaret, tried to calm her, but nothing seemed to help. One entry stood out among the rest, dated October 31st, 1911. Samuel wrote about a terrible storm that had raged that night. The wind howled like a banshee, and the house shook as if it might be torn from its foundations. Emily had been inconsolable, screaming that Lily was angry. The final entry was barely readable, the writing shaky and desperate. Samuel described waking up to find Emily gone. He searched the house, calling her name, but she was nowhere to be found. Then he heard her voice coming from the basement. When he reached the bottom of the stairs, he saw her standing in the center of the room, her eyes wide with terror. Lily was there too. Samuel wrote that he saw her, a dark figure with hollow eyes and a twisted smile. She reached out for Emily, and in that moment, Samuel realized that Lily wasn't just a figment of his daughter's imagination. She was something far more sinister. The journal ended there, with no explanation of what happened next. I closed the book, a chill running down my spine. The story was unsettling, but I told myself it was just that, a story. There was no proof that any of it was real. That night, I had trouble sleeping. I tossed and turned, unable to shake the feeling that I was being watched. Around 3 a.m., I woke up to the sound of whispering. My heart pounded in my chest as I sat up and looked around the darkened room. At first, I saw nothing, But then, out of the corner of my eye, I caught a glimpse of movement. A shadow, darker than the rest, flitted across the room. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight, but there was nothing there. The whispering stopped. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, but deep down, I knew something was wrong. The next day at work, I couldn't focus. The journal's story played over and over in my mind. I decided to do some research, hoping to find out more about Samuel and his family. I spent hours in the local library, searching through old newspapers and records. Finally, I found a small article from November 1911. It reported that the farmhouse had burned down in a mysterious fire. The bodies of Samuel, Margaret, and Emily were never found. The article mentioned that the house had a dark history. Before Samuel's family moved in, it had belonged to a woman named Lillian, who was accused of practicing witchcraft. She was said to have been hanged by the townspeople, but her body was never recovered. Some believed she cursed the land. That night, as I sat in my apartment, the air grew cold. I could see my breath in the dim light. The whispering started again, louder this time. I stood up, my hands shaking, and looked around. The shadow was back, hovering in the corner of the room. "Lily," I whispered, the name slipping out before I could stop myself. The shadow moved closer, and I could see her face, hollow eyes, and a twisted smile, just as Samuel had described. I backed away, my heart racing. "What do you want?" I managed to choke out. She didn't answer with words, but I felt a cold hand grip my arm, and a voice echoed in my mind. "You brought me here." I screamed and pulled away, running out of the apartment. I didn't stop until I reached my car. I drove aimlessly for hours, too terrified to go back. I haven't returned to my apartment since. I don't know what to do. I can't escape the feeling that she's still with me, watching, waiting. I've tried to get rid of the journal, but it always finds its way back to me. I'm trapped, haunted by a darkness I can't understand. I used to laugh at ghost stories. Now I'm living one, and I fear that, like Samuel and his family, I won't survive.